Welcome everyone to our first Pakistan 100 podcast done over Skype. I'm joined today by Shahrukh Wani, who is an economist at the International Growth Center's Cities That Work initiative. He is based out of the Blavatnik School of Government at the University of Oxford. Shahrukh, welcome, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So you're here to talk about cities today. The first, question that comes to mind is, for a policymaker, how important is it to think about cities as opposed to other issues that a developing country will face?
So, thank you. That's a good question. So, essentially, for a few reasons. First of all, once we talk about different policy things, we usually think about them in thematic areas, right? So we talk about housing policy, we will talk about agriculture policy, we might talk about technology policy and stuff like that. And they're very specific themes. They might have cross-thematic implications, but they're usually considered as thematic areas. When we talk about urban policy, we don't talk about a specific thematic area, we talk about a space, a spatial context in which a lot of policies need to be made in order for cities to be livable and productive. So that's one thing which policymakers should understand, is that this is not a small issue. It's more to do with context and space rather than to do with various themes. That's the first thing. Secondly, for developing countries in particular, and particularly for Pakistan, cities are the future. Regardless whether policymakers do something now or they don't do anything, cities are going to grow. And it is usually more affordable and cost effective to start building the infrastructure and institutions right now rather than do it when Lahore is twice the size. So if it's 12 million people right now, if it's 24 million people, it would be harder to build housing and transport and all of that stuff. So time is a very important element in urban policy. So I think that shouldn't be wasted. Third, I would say is that if the goal of a government is economic growth, and as from my interaction with policymakers in Pakistan, I think after raising enough public finances, their second goal is probably to give jobs, which is essentially both of them are interlinked with economic growth. You can't raise enough revenue without growth, and you can't provide jobs if your firms aren't growing enough. So if your aim is both of these factors, then cities, literature and evidence tells us very clearly, are fundamental to productivity, right? And I want to talk a bit about why that's the case, right? So why are cities more productive than rural areas? So essentially, and I'm going to be summarizing this entire literature and will be masquerading it in between, cities allow scale. And we know this for decades, that scale is really important for economic growth and economic productivity. You can be in Lahore sitting and be specializing in something very specific if you're an individual, right? So you can be a lawyer specifying in a very specific matter of law, and you're able to sell that skill because you have enough skill for firms to buy that and people to complement each other into whatever the value chain of that market is. Once you achieve scale, then scale drives specialization, and for both firms and individuals, that usually leads to gains in productivity. That's one thing, right? A second thing is that when people are close to each other, they share ideas. And not only when you're sitting in cafes, you're sharing ideas, but also between firms, right? So when people move from one firm to another firm, they take ideas and expertise, and that leads to generally sharing of knowledge between in a specific dense environment, and that's really good for productivity. Once this happens at scale, happens at a national scale, you end up with a structure which transforms your economy and your country from a largely agrarian country to an urban, more dense environment where people are able to specialize because they have access to larger scale, and they're able to share information and knowledge more easily. So when this happens, this structure transformation, this is the first leg of structure transformation, you also achieve higher growth and productivity. Now, this is pretty much shown everywhere. Virtually every country in the world who has structurally transformed their economy to an urban, to a largely an urban environment. And it's very hard to imagine. I think growth is going to happen differently in every country, but it's very hard to imagine how growth will happen without it passing through cities.
Tell us about what makes a city good or bad in the eyes of an urban policy specialist? What are the qualities of a good city?
Okay, that's a very interesting question. I would, if we split them in two, right? So we say, okay, the two things you need connectivity and you need livability. So a good city, and this is highly. Let me caveat this start this right. So I'm a high believer that there's no absolute knowledge and there's no one true thing. It's all context specific, and every country will have to determine how a city is built based on its spatial makeup, based on its culture, institutions, all of these factors, and there's no one template for every city to succeed. Having said this, two things which I feel are generally really important and how I will split them is one, that they're connected. So cities, and by connectivity, I mean essentially people and firms are able to connect to each other. And this is largely a result of two things: density, whether you have appropriate level of density, and you can debate what appropriate level is, and whether there's transportation networks, which is very important, right? So you can have lower density if you have really good transport, but if you have less adequate transport, you need higher density because people need to move around. The second thing is livability. It's a pretty broad thing, and it's where we don't really work much about, but livability essentially means what makes life worth living in a city. So things like sanitation and waste management, which is really critical, which we don't often talk about, but it's one of the biggest investments cities make when they start growing. That's what New York did and what London did. Healthcare, not have absence of massive rampant crime, public spaces for interaction. All of this makes cities livable, right? So we can debate exactly what it is, but I would generally say a city which is well connected, which largely is a result of density and transport and is livable in a sense, and you can then describe various basic livability measures such as waste management and adequate housing and stuff like that.
Some of these things that you're mentioning are simply the consequence of more resources being available. So England has more income per capita and can invest more in London. Lahore, Pakistan has less, unfortunately, income per capita and can therefore invest less in Lahore. The absolute size of the economy also matters because, like you mentioned, a larger country can support more investment, such as in larger airports, such as in better museums, because then they're aggregating resources from a larger pool of people. And again, a smaller economy like ours would be able to invest in these things less, and that makes sense. That isn't to blame necessarily the urban quality of a city like Lahore as opposed to London. So I guess what I'm trying to get at is what are we doing wrong in the developing world in terms of running our cities, do you think? And what do you think are some key issues that we need to move forward on?
Okay, I'm going to split those in two. First of all, I think that's a very interesting argument. I think that do you need to? Let me rephrase the first thing you said to you. Maybe having better cities would generate more economic growth and would increase the resources for a country to invest, right? So the thing is that it's, of course, there's a problem of reverse causality. You don't really, I can't be comfortable saying either way. It could be that you need to be on the first point really rich in order to build good cities, or you need to build good cities and then become in process of building those good cities rich.
Yeah.
I think that could be the case too. So fixing, this is again problematic words, but for instance, investing in Lahore and really building connectivity and livability, firms grow. For instance, in Pakistan, if I remember correctly, I think I remember from a World Bank report, firms which are 15 years or younger have about 2 or 3 employees on average in Pakistan.
Mm-hmm.
If you allow for firms to grow and specialize and scale, if you build those networks and those institutions and infrastructure necessary to get that scale and specialization for firms and people, you might end up very well increasing the amount of resources you have as a country, right? So resources are not exogenous to a country. You need to build them. As much as Pakistan tries, we can't borrow all the resources from abroad. You need to eventually build some of them domestically. So that I would phrase it a bit differently. I would say, yeah, you need to invest in cities because this is the way you can increase your growth, you can change your structure of your economy, and you will have more resources to invest in other things and have good museums and all of that other stuff. And that transition, that urban transition with Pakistan and many other developing countries, but Pakistan is a subject matter right now, focuses on is that's where the policy question is. That how do you manage that transition from a largely rural or small town economy to an urban economy and like an urban country where majority of people live in urban areas, but they are not living in. So as majority of people move to urban areas, that how do you manage that process? So that essentially has two things, right? So first is that how do you build a city which works for the existing population of Lahore, Karachi, and Hyderabad, and Faisalabad, and Peshawar, and other cities, and then how do you provide them the flexibility enough and the temporal environment enough for them to build these infrastructure institutions for all the people who would move to cities in the coming decades. If 45% of Pakistanis are in rural areas, which the World Bank says, if they will move to, if even half of them will move to urban areas over the next 30, 40 years, you need much more resources in urban environments to cater them. So what happens usually is that you have cities, so people end up moving to cities regardless of what the government does. They come for benefits of density, right? So they come there because they want to increase incomes, but they find it's congestion. Because if you don't have good policy in place, urbanization is a very messy process. And you end up with congested environments where people can't afford to live. For instance, this is something, I don't have the number for Pakistan, but in African cities, sub-Saharan African cities, it's more costly to live there than to live in a European or a North American city on percentage of the per capita income. Because they end up spending huge amounts of money on transport, right? So if you are in Lahore, if you want to hire a rickshaw to go to work every morning, you're going to end up spending I spent a summer there working on an internship. I spent I don't know ridiculous amounts of more than the stipend I got to spend on that rickshaw. So that becomes really costly. So the key policy question is how do you fix that? So the first order, and this is usually where I fall, and I might change my mind over the coming months or years, as one does. The first thing is to get the basics right, and I think we talked about this earlier, is to get the land rights and property rights done. Majority of, not majority, I don't remember the number, but large sizable, you might know this, sizable number of court cases in Pakistan are on property right. I know the number from African cities where it's like 90%. In Pakistan, I remember someone told me it was around 50% or something. You need to, and that's an indication of how bad your property rights are. So the basic thing one needs to build a city that works is that you need land rights which are secure, tradable, marketable. So land moves between buyers efficiently and effectively, so the land is utilized in its best possible use. So you don't get a central area in Lahore or Karachi where land is not utilized properly. That is the first basic thing. And then one needs to think about is how do you build the institutional environment around the city. So I'm working on a paper which should come out if I ever complete it, which is called on urban authorizing environments, right? So by what that I and my co-authors mean is essentially the institutional environment under which decisions are taken in a city. So if a city needs to make decisions over a long span of time, which they need to have the institutional mechanisms possible for that decision making to happen. They can't be fragmented over urban space. They need to have integrated authority over specific urban space. They need to be accountable, which is really important. So in Pakistan's history, our local governments have usually been accountable upwards, right? So they're accountable to a secretary or a minister sitting in the provincial capital rather than to the people they're governing. That needs to move downwards. And all of that is going to help build an institutional environment under which is generally first order conducive to good policies to emerge. Now, that doesn't mean that good policies will emerge, but that means that it is more likely for them to emerge generally from our cross-country experiences. From that point of view, then you can talk about the build environment where you want to zone stuff, where what kind of thematic, how do you build more dense housing? For instance, even if you take housing as an example, if you fix or if you improve your land rights, you're going to solve a lot of problem around housing immediately. If you have a good urban government which is accountable to its people, that is very likely to take more action on housing. So all of this is really, so this is sort of the first point of departure when it comes to thinking about cities that thrive. One thing really I still think about is Karachi. So Karachi is really badly run. And a part of that is that the institutional environment of Karachi is so deeply fragmented. About half of the country's cities' land authorities exist with the local government. This provincial government provides so much urban services. Parts of the land the urban government won't have any control over. That kind of fragmentation, you can't really get good policy. I can go to Karachi, or if a really good mayor of Karachi comes along, he or she might not be able to do anything because they don't have enough control. So that sort of institutional environment you need in place is the first sort of question for countries like Pakistan to think about. And then other things come along, and then there needs to be debate and discussion on all of other thematic and policy-specific issues. But I think that's where it starts.
So, Shahrukh, some of Karachi's problems are common to all Pakistani cities. And you mentioned, a couple of the things that you mentioned were transport and property rights. Now, transport might be an urban-specific problem, but property rights is something that is across the country, rural and urban combined. And so how I've thought about this in the past is I've seen a lot of shops that are selling the same type of service or product situated right next to one another. And this contrasts with most of the cities that I've lived in the West, where there will at least be firms will be less in number but larger in size often. And so the other thing that's really stuck with me over time is that I've seen firms both expand and crash very rapidly in my time living in the West. So I was in the US when Border Books went bankrupt. This was a large chain spread across the country. Same with Toys R Us, same with Circuit City, and there are other examples. And these were large enterprises spreading the length and breadth of the US that you don't see traces of anymore. And so that's actually a good thing. That says that when a business model stops working, we move on from it very quickly. In Pakistan, businesses don't die quickly, they wither away. And the reason that they wither away seems to be, to me, that people will, if you have any assets, you're not able to move them from your current allocation away to invest in someone else's better operations because you're worried that that person will run away with your money, right? And this would sort of also then move to, this is perhaps more of an example on the commercial side, why our commercial operations aren't dense and they're spread out. And again, as you mentioned, we have a lack of agglomeration effects then because the roadblock seems to be the lack of good property rights and the ability to invest with one another. Presumably, the same thing happens with our land market, where if you think that you're in a really sort of congested area, as you mentioned, you think that a high-rise will make sense, and we have, when you think about it, the same amount of brick and mortar in place in that locality. It's just horizontal rather than vertical, and the reason is that horizontal means that it is that each person has their own little piece rather than combining efforts.
Yes.
So I totally understand what you're saying there, and that's something that is not just for urban issues. It's also something that's important for mining, for agriculture, for fisheries, everything, things that have nothing to do with cities. But then in the quality of transports and zoning, what do you think a country like ours, a resource-constrained country like ours, can do about that?
So I think you hit. That's a very, very important point, and I think that's it deserves clarification. Land rights is not the only property rights. Land right is a much more urban property right, which urban economists are much more concerned about because it's it has a very strong implication on the built environment of the city, right? So that and also very strong implication on financing the city because we like to finance cities through land because their value appreciates as urbanization occurs. But larger property right, that's why the argument of building urban institutional environments comes secondary to building property rights, which I agree with you. It's a needs to be a national or provincial policy question. It requires much more investment in codes and enforcement and all of that stuff which you know more about. And firms die, and they need to be let die. Need to die, and they need to die in urban areas and rural areas, and they can die. They need to be allowed to die nationally. And there's a larger question around misallocation of Pakistan's economy, and there's a very strong political element to that misallocation, right? So the infants we are still feeding after 70 years, who don't grow for some reason. So that's a very, very interesting point and a very, very valid point, and I'm 100% agreement with you. And I think that's a question which needs to happen alongside any investment in urban policy, because I think without that, it's really hard to run cities effectively if you don't have good property rights. On your second thing about transport and zoning and investment in transport, I would say transport is really considering limited resources. I think that's what you said, right? Once you have decent enough urban institutions, right? So ideally that would include an urban government, which has integrated authority over an urban space. That urban government is able to has credible commitment on how much transfers it gets from a provincial or federal government. In Pakistan's case, it will be provincial. And that, at least in Punjab's new law, there is credible commitment around that. It's 26 to 28% of the transfers, and there's a commission and there's a method through which that's going to happen. So it can't be that the mayor of Lahore is an opposition mayor and the transfers are stopped or are given to Wasa instead of the new urban government. So it needs to be credibly commitment. There needs to be a lot of credible commitment around those transfers, and that needs to be supplemented strongly with local finances, and that helps Pakistan, and that helps Pakistan's federal and provincial government because they don't have enough money. And if cities are able to raise a good chunk of their own expenditure locally, that will decrease the burden on service delivery for provincial federal government. And that can happen through largely through land and property, and that comes back to you need land rights in order for governments to tax land accurately. If you don't know who owns the land, it's very hard for you to tax. And if urban governments are allowed to tax land and property and have conducive environment in order to do so, that will give you a good revenue source to make investments in transport. But again, transport is really expensive. Building a BRT is a really expensive, chunky investment, and it will pay off. It doesn't pay off. Usually you subsidize it. It will never be really that sustainable, and it pays off at a larger sort of larger economic gains for the city rather than specifically you can't charge that much, right? So usually then you end up with what kind of financing mechanisms you look, right? So you can there are various things. You can use the land around major transport investment. You can apply betterment levies around that. I really love Hong Kong's model, but I understand that can't really happen in most countries in which they essentially make large commercial investments around major transport nodes, around shopping complexes and offices, and then they use that to essentially subsidize the transport network. So there's enough, I would say, accumulated global expertise on how you can finance these large chunky investments, and that it shouldn't be impossible to do so. If you have that credible commitment in place for intra-government transfers, and a good chunk of local financing. And then, of course, you can always leverage private capital. You can leverage over years. I think cities like Lahore and Karachi will have to or should ideally build their own international borrowing capacity. And if you have that over the years, and I think South Africa does this very well, in which you can able to raise money through bonds, and you can able to get loans, even if the federal government has to provide sovereign guarantees or something, but you are able to raise enough investment to invest in these sort of large anchor structures.
All right. I had a long list of questions to ask, but we're out of time. Really appreciate your thoughts. I'll give you the final word. If you think that there's something that we really need to pay attention to right now, if you have anything, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I'll give you the final word, and thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, thank you for having me, first of all. Well, the final word, I think, which is pretty clear from our conversation, I think um, uh, do focus on cities. I think there needs to be inherent and very clear and overt decision made that we need to invest in cities, and we need to invest in these. But instead of what we do is usually productize reforms, right? So we're going to have this reform. It's driven by this person in power, and we're going to do this. Instead of that, focus on building the underlying structures you need to have good cities. So, good governments, which are accountable, and of course, think about these larger structural reasons why Pakistan's economy is holding back, and which are going to be national questions, right? So the questions around property rights, or misallocation, or incentives you're making for larger firms who are not dying enough, which sounds really terrible of me, but they should die. And all of these questions are going to be answered. So I think thinking about this logically over long term and constructively is something I would advise. And I'm very hopeful that this will happen.
That's a perfect note on which to end. Thank you very much, Shahrukh.
Thank you very much. Have fun.